Hi, everyone. Welcome to Harlem Stories. Today it may just be with me. I'm not quite sure. I haven't heard back from Mark. He might be stuck on the subway. Very New York thing. Welcome to another episode of Harlem Stories. And today I am going to be discussing getting to know Central Harlem. And you know what? There's so much to talk about. It's such a rich topic that we're going to actually break this up into a two-part episode, 2 episodes, and just a little bit of housekeeping, before I get started. Just a reminder that right now we are on a bi-weekly schedule, and, we wanted to make sure that there's some great content for you to listen to. So today, getting to know Central Harlem. I think it's important to kind of get started and discuss about the neighborhood borders. And I think a lot of people, kind of confuse Central Harlem, South Harlem, West Harlem. And so I think it's kind of important for us to discuss the border areas. Just as a reminder, I view the eastern border as Fifth Avenue, and the western border, which is going to be lined by parks, throughout all aspects of Harlem, with the exception of a few blocks here and there. But these parks and the topography and the height distance that's located within these parks, that's really the defining factor for me between Central Harlem and West Harlem. Whereas West Harlem neighborhoods are, in the Heights, Morningside Heights, Hamilton Heights, and also Manhattanville, which is not as elevated, but it's part of the West Harlem neighborhoods. And you'll notice that there's parks that go, going from south to north, going along that line that really divides Central Harlem to West Harlem and that elevation difference. On the southern border is 110th Street, and on the northern border is 155th Street. And, most important to understand is, that, people also add in the additional classification of South Harlem. And South Harlem is really part of Central Harlem, and just want to make that important distinction between the two neighborhoods. And I think it's more for marketing purposes than anything, but it just kind of really helps define from 110 to 125th, and that eastern and western border that I described before. So that really kind of helps, define that. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance, Central and West Harlem were the center of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a major African-American cultural movement. And that Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural revival of African-American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, and even, for that matter, scholarship. Poets and writers and musicians from that era are still considered among the greatest of all time, the GOAT, if you will. And just to name a few of those individuals that I'm talking about, and obviously I don't want to leave anybody out, but just to kind of keep this on a time basis, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, but there's so many more. A few other leaders than outside of the literary and music world. W.E.B. Du Bois, human rights activist, Madam C.J. Walker, and I think there was like a Netflix or Hulu show on her in maybe about 2 years ago. Marcus Garvey, just to name a few. So, we talked a little bit about like the sub-neighborhoods, but, getting into that a little bit, and the historic districts. I've already mentioned South Harlem, but, in addition to that distinction of that, generally you think of stronger retail options in general, for that, in terms of like cafes and restaurants, lounges, supermarkets in general, which has now now been improving quite significantly. You've had a Whole Foods, the Lincoln Market, now over 300 West 122nd Street, or 300 West as it's known. You've got a Trader Joe's opening shortly, and I think that will come across as a timed time out, in terms of dated feel, as this episode ages. But Trader Joe's is about to open pretty shortly, and you'll also have a little in terms of some of the others in the food area. Levain, they're known for their cookies. They recently expanded into, multiple other markets outside of New York City, but they are, pretty well famous for that. More locally, you've got Lee's, known for their rugla, Bo's Bagels, and Sugar Hill Creamery. These are just a few of them. South Harlem has a little bit more of also a concentration of newer, higher end luxury condos. But, just one thing, and I think this is, kind of just ring back and ring hard with neighborhood residents. It really hasn't resonated well is the neighborhood shortcut name Soha. It's taken gentrification a little out of control. So, just, make sure South Harlem is fine, but Central Harlem is, the larger classification of that neighborhood. In terms of, additional other little sub-neighborhoods that we might have is Linel Senegal, or Le Petit Senegal. It's a West African immigrant community, not exactly defined borders, but around 116th Street, roughly, between Lenox and Frederick Douglass. But it's not entirely 100% defined that way either. But that just gives you a general sense of things. There's the Mount Morris Park Historic District. It's a 16-block historic district from West 118th Street to West 124th Street, and it's Fifth Avenue, and it's between Fifth Avenue and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. The park itself was a rocky hill of mica schist used by Native Americans to see over the majority of the islands. And Governor Morris, founding father who wrote the preamble to the U.S. Constitutional, it's named after him. There was a Doctor's Row in that vicinity over there, one of a number of Doctor's Rows in Manhattan, and that's between West 122nd Street, between Mount Morris Park West and Malcolm X Boulevard. The neighborhood is further defined as, having row houses and church architecture that fills this historic district. And you'll find architectural styles such as Romanesque Revival, Neo-Grec, Queen Anne, and some other, very stylistic, architecture, of the homes and buildings that are in that area. Another, and actually the timing of this one is quite interesting. There's a book released on it, but there's Astor Row, and there's a book. I just saw a story on CNN late last night, and again, this will come across dated at a later point, but it was a book on the Astor family, and but there's a subsection of Central Harlem known as Astor Row. And Astor Row is 28 row houses. It's on the south side of West 130th Street between 5th and Lenox. The houses were designed by James Buick between 1880 and 1883 on land owned by John Jacob Astor. He had purchased it in 1884 for, I know these numbers seem crazy, but back then this was expensive. But $10,000 he had purchased, this large section of a block. So, amazing. But, the power of inflation there. Astor's grandson, William Backhouse Astor Jr., was the driving force for the development. These houses, they're really fascinating. They're 3-story brick, single-family houses, or at least that's the way that they were originally designed. And they are set back from the street with front and side yards and wooden porches. That's something you just really don't see very often in Manhattan. I know I've seen it in the northern section of Hamilton Heights, lower section of Washington Heights, and I know I've seen it down, I want to say Tribeca-ish. I've seen a few homes like that. But, having these front wooden porches, that's really a nice little touch, but something you don't really see. And this is a whole block of them. It's been a New York City landmark since August 11th, 1981. And after so many years of difficult economic circumstances, once they were landmarked, money was raised to restore the facades and to repair, upgrade internal systems. Since that point, almost all the houses have been restored, though in 2021, number 28 West 130th Street was demolished following years of degradation. And, and going back to the porches for just a moment, the Astor Foundation has since offered to provide grant money to help maintain these porches in perpetuity. So, even though the Astor family is, largely, gone at this point, they might be entirely have passed at this stage. I'm not quite sure. But their legacy certainly still lives on in terms of their buildings and their generosity as well. In terms of, additional historic districts that are within Central Harlem, you also have Scrivers Row. And Scrivers Row is located on both sides of West 138th Street and West 139th Street between Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard and Frederick Douglass Boulevard. So for those of you that don't know Harlem geography but know the city, ACP, or Adam Clayton Powell, is known as 7th Avenue, while Frederick Douglass Boulevard is also AKA 8th Avenue. It's a national and New York City historic district with row houses built in 1891 to 1893. There were 3 sets of buildings that David H. King Jr., who was the developer, built in the 1889 New York Times building. Oh, I'm sorry, got that messed up. David H. King Jr., he was the developer, but he had built the 1889 New York Times Square building. He built the MSG designed building by Stanford White, and he also built the base for the Statue of Liberty. The red and brick townhouse brownstone buildings on the south side of West 138th, or 2350 to 2354, Adam Clayton Jr. Boulevard. It was designed by James Lord Brown in the Georgian revival style. And there's a yellow brick and white limestone with terracotta trim buildings on the north side of 138th, on the south side of 139th, known as 2360 through 2378, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, designed by Bryce Price and Clarence S. Luce in the colonial revival side. The dark brick brownstone and terracotta buildings on the north side of 139th, which is also known as 2380 Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, were designed in the Italian Renaissance revival style by pre-war architect Stanford White of the firm McKim, Mead and White. And anybody that that knows the old pre-war architects from back in the day, they are one of the premier architecture firms in New York City. And New York City, the city itself, landmarked this block or these blocks in 1967, and it was put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. 1975. Now, these homes, they were originally called the King Model Houses. And they were intended for the upper middle class whites. They featured modern amenities and dark woodwork with views of City College. And, if you look in, the backyard, which there is no real backyard, but there's an alley there, they sit back to back, sharing a rear courtyard and alleyway. And if you go into that real alleyway, or if you go outside the home, you just look to the west and you'll see the City College buildings, up on the hill. So some of them have entrance gates. Actually, there's a couple that still remain, where the entrance gates into the, that alleyway, that rear courtyard area, still have signs that, are, I guess, engraved into the cement over there that says "Walk your horses." So, it really is, a real throwback to, to the period in which these were constructed, and these still remain over there. These alleys allowed for stabling of horses, of course, and for delivery of supplies without disrupting activities in the main houses. Today, these are used as garages, and many have built decking above the garage to create a private outdoor space. Because these homes, unlike your typical townhouse, which is 99 feet long, or just about 100 feet long, they typically are that deep because they contain a standardized size backyard, whereas these don't. These have the alley in place of a backyard. Only a few of the homes of these were originally sold, and almost all wound up getting foreclosed on. They sat empty for years until they were finally made available to the African American community. Generally, they attracted both leaders of the Black community and upwardly mobile professionals, or what they deemed as strivers, giving the development the name of Strivers Row. Notable and past and present residents include Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, which I'm not giving any away state secret there, and primarily because it's been stated in the past. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who's the avenue is named after, and he was a politician. Bill Bojangles Robinson, and it wasn't that long ago that Bob Dylan called it home as well. In terms of pop culture, Cab Calloway mentioned Strivers Row in the songs Hard Times, Topsy Turvy, and The Ghost of Smokey Joe. The row is mentioned in the song Harlem Blues on the soundtrack to Spike Lee's Mo Better Blues, and Jungle Fever has a scene filmed on Strivers Row. And if you'll notice, if you ever took notice, and I never did until I started researching for this episode over here, Strivers Row is the name for Penguin Random House Publishing imprint created to elevate the African-American writer. So I did not know that. And hopefully, maybe you guys learned something as well in this episode of interest. And Colson Whitehead, best-selling author, he's written a couple novels that reference Strivers Row. So that's just another example of the many, many historic districts in Central Harlem. So now we go on to the newest historic district that has been created, the Dorrance Brooks Square Historic District. It was only about 2.5 years ago that the New York City Landmark Preservation Committee voted unanimously for this to become a landmark district. It's the first in the city named after an African American. So, kudos, that we're achieving diversity in so many other different ways. And I just, it makes me proud to live in New York City, to see that kind of diversity. It's named after Dorrance Brooks, who lived from 1893 to 1918. He's a Black soldier who died while serving in the segregated military during World War I. And he was a member of the 369th Infantry Regiment, better known, and I've seen this, everywhere, and but better known as the Harlem Hellfighters. So I think that's pretty cool. And now there's a historic district. It's actually located in two different locations that have kind of jagged borders that are largely separated by Frederick Douglass Boulevard. And I think that's because, some of these are newer constructions over years. So the borders I'm going to describe it's not exactly precise, and not every lot is included in the broad description I'm providing, but it's close enough for the listeners of this episode to get a sense of the area. And I would define it as Group 1 is St. Nicholas Avenue, just south of 140th, going down to 136th as the western border. And on the eastern side, it excludes most of the properties along Frederick Douglass Boulevard, but includes one lot further to the west. And then the second group is mostly the 2 blocks south of Strivers Row, along 136th and 137th Street, just south of Strivers Row. Landmarks preservation can provide an exact map of the newly formed historic district, and the Historic District Council released an entire mini booklet in their 6 to Celebrate series. And you can actually go onto the Harlem Stories website, download a lot of these 6 to Celebrate series because there's multiple districts that are contained, within that. The area is really considered mostly residential. It's mostly Renaissance Revival and Queen Anne style row houses that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s or so. And during that period, many of these buildings became medical offices, sort of like a doctor's row, which sort of makes sense too, because when you consider that Harlem Hospital is only at 135th to like 136th or so, over at Lenox. So just a block or two away, from this historic district. So that makes sense. In terms of we talked about like these historic districts and these mini districts, and but now let's kind of move away and talk about an area that's always of interest to me: higher education. And there's multiple universities that or colleges that exist in this area. You've got Touro College of Osteopathic Medicine. You've got New York College of Sorry, I'm not getting my words straight today, but the podiatrist school, and you have CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, as well as a branch of the College of New Rochelle. We have multiple parks in Central Harlem, and again, this is kind of like a recurring theme that you have throughout all these episodes. Is just that there's so much greenery in these areas. You've got Morningside Park, which is a 30-acre park from 110th, just a block west of the northern corner of Central Park, to 123rd Street on the north side, Morningside Avenue in Harlem on the east, and Morningside Drive, not to get that confused at all, in Morningside Heights on the west. And like most parks in Central Harlem, it forms the dividing line, and I mentioned this, when we opened the episode, that, there's a cliff made of Manhattan schist running throughout the park, and that's really helps define the line over here. The park includes other rock outcroppings, man-made pond, and waterfall. The waterfall is currently broken, but funding has recently come available to fix the waterfall and algae situation. The Morningside Park also includes multiple athletic fields, a playground, a dog run, barbecue area, and an arboretum. As is the case with so many parks in the city, Olmsted and Vox designed the park. Those names as primarily, if you're not familiar with them, from other episodes. Most people are familiar with them from designing Central Park. Today, the the Large has a large and growing farmers market at the 110th Street and Morningside Avenue in Harlem on Saturdays throughout much of the year. So, that is kind of a fan favorite. You'll always see a lot of people at that farmers market. In terms of additional parks, we've got Mount Morris Park, Marcus Garvey Park, which is, depending on, which name you go by, it is the same park. Marcus Garvey Park was opened in December 1st, 1840 as Mount Morris Park by Robert H. Morris. He was the 64th mayor of New York City, according to the Marcus Garvey Park Alliance. And in 1967, the original amphitheater and recreation center were completed. And in 1968, the Harlem Cultural Festival was organized. The festival involved into a series of 6 afternoon concerts in 1969 that became known as Black Woodstock. And I think there's like some streaming service has a documentary on this as well. I want to say it's Hulu, could be. I don't remember, but it was one of the large streaming services. But performers, from this event included Stevie Wonder, Malia Jackson, Nina Simone, The Fifth Dimension, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Sly and the Family Stone, the Staple Singers, and B.B. King. Yeah, actually, here it is. I actually did have it in my notes. So it was featured in the Oscar-winning 2021 documentary Summer of Soul, directed by Questlove. So I don't know which the Summer of Soul, which service it's streaming on, but this is the actual documentary that I had been discussing. In the 1970s, advocacy groups suggested renaming the park for Marcus Garvey, the publisher, journalist, entrepreneur, and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. The city council voted to rename the park in 1973. So, newcomers, know the park as Marcus Garvey Park. Moving on to the next one, and there's just it just feels like there's so much green space, and it just takes so much of our time. But St. Nicholas Park, and we actually did an entire episode on St. Nicholas. It's located also in Central Harlem on the edge of Manhattanville and Hamilton Heights. It's nearly 23 acres from 128th Street to 141st Street, and from St. Nicholas Avenue in Central Harlem to St. Nicholas Terrace. Again, really easy to confuse, all the St. Nicholases, and there's even more. But St. Nicholas Terrace to the west in Manhattanville and Hamilton Heights. It was created in 1895 as a result of the condemnation of the Croton Aqueduct. This acquisition, along with some of the additional property construction on the park, began in 1906. Named after St. Nicholas, the patron saint of Amsterdam. His likeness adorned one of the ships that brought the first Dutch settlers to New Amsterdam. As I mentioned before, we have an entire episode dedicated to St. Nicholas Park, and in 2008, Alexander Hamilton's historic home has moved around the corner and into the park. And, we're going to talk also separately about the Grange. Finally, in this first part of 2 parts, we're going to talk about Jackie Robinson Park, previously also known as Colonial Park, a bit shy of 13 acres on the border of Hamilton Heights in Central Harlem. It's located from 145th Street to 155th Street, Edgecombe Avenue to the west, and Bradhurst Avenue to the east. And the park in 1978 was renamed after Jackie Robinson. This park actually has baseball fields, basketball courts, a public gym, and a swimming pool, which was part of the Works Progress Administration, or most people today, are familiar with the short name of it, WPA, that was built during the Great Depression. And there's also a band shell, which they do hold live concerts there. And it's worth mentioning that the north end of the park connects up with 155th Street Viaduct adjacent to the former Polo Ground Stadium and the Macomb Stand Bridge. And almost immediately after crossing over to the Bronx side of the bridge is Yankee Stadium. So, we'll be back with a part 2 of getting to know Central Harlem. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Harlem Stories, and we will be back to you soon with part 2.